There we go. We're recording our class so we don't miss it again. So we're only 4 right now. I feel like a few more should be here by now, but who knows what's happening. It's a beautiful day, so maybe people are outside. So we will get started anyway, because we have a ton of material to cover. And I'm just going to turn off my video here. There we go. So last week we ended off with this image with Edwin Holgate nude in a landscape. And so we had just gone through all of the group of 7 and had started with the Beaver Hall group. The big difference, if you remember, and we haven't gone through a lot of, we had just started getting into the Beaver Hall group, but kind of like the big difference between the two groups is that, one, the group of 7 was based in Toronto, whereas the Beaver Hall group was based out of Beaver Hall, incidentally, in Montreal. And the other characteristic that was traditional to the group of 7 was that they were pretty much solely based in landscape, except for a few examples that we saw from, say, Varley, who did some portraiture, some figurative paintings. Whereas the Beaver Hall group was kind of the opposite. They were largely based in portraiture or in cityscapes or in landscapes that had, that were sort of non-traditionally portrayed. So this is where we ended off. And this last image that we had said by Holgate, we're starting to see a sort of bit of surrealism coming through in this one. There's the way that he renders his reclining nude against the landscape is reminiscent of, say, images that we would see from Salvador Dali. So we're starting to see these different sort of styles coming through. This is Randolph S. Houghton, Miss Mary McIntosh. And again, so this portrait is a little bit more realistically rendered, but we can still see the painterly skill that is used here. And as we saw with in previous portraits, the idea of having the sitter kind of in an atmosphere, with a backdrop now, like just like a monochromatic or a full color backdrop, rather than putting them in a landscape, is something that we're seeing more often now too. In traditional portraiture from, say, Baroque era or from Renaissance, we would see portraiture, but the people were placed in a setting, or at least placed, on a throne or on a big chair or on a bed, or they were placed somewhere. But this makes it a little bit more abstract because it's really as if it's like a backdrop sheet. And we've seen this a few times too, where the color of the backdrop is found again in the sitter's clothing, or in a tone on their face. In this case, it's this almost the same as her dress. So it's sort of a modern way of portraying the landscape. And also, furthermore, this is modern woman. She's got her big fur on. This is clearly a woman of leisure, a woman with money, a woman from the aristocracy. She's got her kind of like flapper headpiece on, and we can tell that she's not a woman who, probably works very hard for her lifestyle. Here we have Kathleen Moore Morris. This is the Byward Market, so obviously the Byward Market in Ottawa. And we saw a landscape like this, or I should say a cityscape like this, with elements of nature being the horses, but obviously, horses were something that were common to see in a town coming through, carrying people or goods. So we see here the very kind of open byward market. We see there's that courtyard there, which is the market space. We have a church in the background, some buildings, but nothing is very detailed. Nothing has a lot of, you know, specific rendering of faces or even the horses' faces, really. Everything is kind of muted. And it's really about setting the tone of the space rather than any particular detail. Here's one of my favorites, favorite characters from, or favorite painters, I should say, from the Beaver Hall group, and that is Adrien Hébert. And this is nude, basically, it's just called nude. So nudes were a popular motif in 19th century Western art, and they saw a resurgence in Canada in the 1920s. In his early career, after a short time in France during 22-23, Hébert developed an interest in painting nudes. Stylistically, he chose a post-impressionistic approach similar to that of Edwin Holgate, showing a more academic interest. So just like everything in history, you know, the literature is saying here that it's a post-impressionistic approach, which shows more academic interest. So it's going back to that academic after going from academic to, you know, romantic to things that were a little bit more like painterly, and then moving towards impressionist and then post-impressionist. And then there was sort of like a breaking point in, for certain artists, you know, some went more towards more like further down the rabbit hole of modernism, and so into cubism and surrealism, and then eventually abstract expressionism, which we're going to see as we move forward. But some went back to academic renditions in their paintings because, you know, it was like they reached a breaking point where like the brushstrokes, the paintings, the forms and figures were getting so loose that, well, you either continued down that vein or you sort of return to basics. And we see that in history, you know, during, let's say, the way that Renaissance then turned into Baroque, which was a little bit more gaudy, and then went into Rococo, which was very, very flamboyant. There were lots of light pinks and light purples and golds and shells and cherubs. And that was like sort of, so like, let's compare Baroque with Impressionism, and then Rococo with Post-Impressionism. And then the idea after that came neoclassicism came back, which is sort of this like return to academia and academic renditions, which is kind of what we see happening here with Hébert. Besides his nudes, he was very much known for his cityscapes. So he broke radically from the picturesque art of his contemporaries, believing that painting in Quebec had become mired in an ostentatious traditionalism. His interest lay in painting scenes of modern life, including this bird's eye view of ships in the Montreal harbor, a subject close to his heart. The sharp diagonal and vertical lines set against the smoky background give this painting its energy. So, you know, this is a completely different way of rendering a cityscape. So we have seen a few cityscapes, just like Kathleen Moore Morris's or Mabel Mays, when we saw her sort of rooftops around University Street, and we saw that church that we were discussing, which one it was. I think that Tanya had said that it was Christ Church. Anyway, this is a much more angular rendition of a cityscape from close up, and as we said, from a bird's eye view. But Hébert finds ways of doing these cityscapes where it's like he's not only taking it from an interesting angle or painting it from an interesting angle, but his paintings are all about the angles. So here's another one, elevator number 1. So again, here the viewpoint is from street level, looking forward and looking up. But again, even the way that there's like a sloped roof hanging down over the very top of the painting, we can see that the only thing that you really see that is natural, is nature, are the clouds through the buildings. But otherwise, it's really just a bunch of steel angles. And here we return to his portraiture. So against the background of a log cabin, rolling hills, and a cloud-filled sky, an unidentified musician stands on a platform or deck. The music of his harmonica is linked to nature and to the rural life of farmers and loggers rather than to the city. In the 20s, Hébert's friend, the musician Léopold Morin, and others promoted the growth of an indigenous Canadian music derived from popular or folk traditions, an ideal evoked in this portrait. So, it's a portrait as much as it's kind of a storytelling piece where Hébert is demonstrating the fact that at this point in time was when musicians were starting to develop or trying to develop a sound in music that was Canadian. Just like their art came from Europe, a lot of the music came from Europe as well. So at a certain point, there has to be a kind of changing of the guard where the music that is created is now created by Canadians in Canada with a kind of Canadian sound. And this is a demonstration of when this started to happen. This one I find really interesting. There wasn't much of a write-up at all on it, but I just put it in because John Y. Johnstone, this is Chinatown in Montreal. And I find the way that this was painted very interesting. It's quite abstract. There's no, we saw in Kathleen Morris's rendition of the Byward Market that there weren't any facial features painted into the market goers, but that was from much further away, whereas this is a much more close-up image. And I find it strange that for such a close-up image, you can see the outline of the eye socket and perhaps part of the nose and the cheekbone, but really no facial features actually painted in. And the angle of the shadow is really interesting, as well as the individual in the shadows in the doorway that we can see. I find that this is moving towards abstraction in the way that it's about color and form balancing more than about any kind of detail. And next we come to Anne Savage. Oh, I didn't write her name's not in here because it was part of her exhibition, but so this is Little Pine by Anne Savage. So Anne Savage was born into an upper middle class family at the end of the Victorian era, and she was materially able to pursue a career which she chose to divide between artistic practice and teaching. According to her biographers, this division of her professional life was mirrored by a division of her calendar. So during the school year, she spent most of her time teaching, while her intensive artistic activities took place primarily during the summer break. This partitioning would have a significant effect on both her artistic output and its reception. A close connection was indeed created between her painting, practiced outdoors, and the places where she regularly vacationed with her family, in particular, a cottage on Lake Wonish in the Laurentians, and Métis Beach in the Lower St. Lawrence as well, where she had spent summers as a child. Savage's class privilege and professional life gave her a certain degree of financial independence, typical of the early 20th century's new woman. According to Leah Sherman, who was her biographer, these formats, as opposed to large canvases, because we can see that this is quite a bit smaller, seem to better suit the pragmatic limits of Savage's practice. Actually, this particular canvas is quite big, but a lot of her paintings that she did were actually oil on cardboard or oil on like a thick paper, like a cardstock almost, and they were quite small, almost as if they were done out of like a sketchbook type thing. And the idea is that she used that format a lot because it was easy to take with her. So just to give you a little bit of like background here. I mean, we'll go a little bit into her background in the next couple of slides, but just so you know, so Anne Savage was largely associated with Concordia University and the Bina Ellen Art Gallery, which is the art gallery in the library building of Concordia, is home to a lot of Anne Savage's paintings. And Leah Sherman, who was her biographer, was also the person who established, one of the establishing members of the fine arts faculty at Concordia. So here's April in the Laurentians, oil on canvas. Again, that's 50.9 by 61 centimeters, not inches. So smaller here as well. And so she has kind of a style, and her style evolved over the years. She kind of went back and forth. She painted a lot of like flowers and gardens, but landscape wise, you know, I find it partially reminiscent of the Group of Seven, but it has a Montreal feel to it. So it's almost like a hybrid between the Beaver Hall group and the Group of Seven, which a lot of the Beaver Hall group who did practice landscape painting for sure took some inspiration from the Group of Seven. This is the Skeena River in BC. So although is not as well traveled as some artists of her generation because of the fact that she was teaching a lot, Savage did make several significant voyages through her career, thus participating in the emergence of a then new form of cultural tourism in Canada. After having spent a certain period of time in the late 1910s and early 20s in Minneapolis, where she studied commercial art at the Minneapolis School of Design, she traveled to Europe in the summer of 1924. She there explored French and British cities such as Quimper, Oxford, Concarneau, where she produced numerous urban and architecturally inspired works. Over the following years and decades, she also would travel to Western Canada on 3 different occasions, the first time as an artist and the following 2 as an educator, thus benefiting from the railway industry that was getting up and going and the connections being made between it and the Canadian artistic institutions during this period. So in 27, she was invited by the National Gallery of Canada and Quebec anthropologist Marius Barbeau to travel to the Skeena River in British Columbia with her friend, the sculptor Florence Weil, in order to visually document the Indigenous culture of this region for the purpose of preserving and by the same token promoting it. So there's a lot of Canadian artists that went kind of coast to coast from whether it was from west to east or vice versa, from the Canadian Railway. And so we see artists who have depicted the same places at the same time, you know, Emily Carr versus now Anne Savage, and we'll see renditions again as we go through. But it's interesting to see the treatment of different artists with these same scenes. And by treatment, I mean the way that it's treated on the canvas and depicted. So she also taught at the Banff School of Fine Arts for a short time as well. This is called Indian Camp, and it's presented as a somewhat Canadian form of modernist romanticism, without pointing to the settler colonial Canadian states' contemporary efforts throughout the 1920s to erase First Nations peoples and cultures. So when biographers did the study of Anne Savage's works, was kind of at a time when people were starting to re-examine the idea of colonialism and re-examine Canadian art history through a lens of colonialism and how certain representations were romanticized and weren't depicted properly. As we spoke about in our previous classes, you know, with regard to Paul Kane, with regard to Emily Carr, the way that these artists, perhaps saw themselves as just documenting what was going on, and especially Emily Carr documenting what was going on in the West Coast when it came to clear cutting, when it came to these erased cultures and erased tribes of Indians, of the indigenous people. Whereas she thought that she was doing the best that she could. Other art historians or indigenous peoples have throughout the years pointed fingers at certain wrong things that were occurring there, certain details in the work and in the literature. And Anne Savage as well has been, I don't want to say a victim, but has been put under a kind of magnifying glass, her work in certain cases as well. So this would be a case like that, where the idea of indigenous culture is romanticized and posed, actually, because here it's made into a symmetrical, constructed image that is clearly not a natural one. But again, it wasn't necessarily done on purpose to hurt anybody, but these things come up as history evolves and as things change within the recordings of history. And here is a still life from Anne Savage. I put this one in honestly because there was such great feedback from Ozias Leduc's still lifes that I showed before, and Anne Savage was also influenced by the work of Ozias Leduc. So this is a very loose kind of oil on panel sketch that I have to imagine was done during one of her travels, or even maybe something that was being put together for one of her classes that she was going to teach. But I really like the treatment of the panel, like the oil on the panel where you can see the panel coming through. Here we move on to Peggy Nicol. So this is Hazelton. So Peggy Nicol was born in small town Ontario and lived in Ottawa for much of her life. She displayed artistic talent and a bohemian outlook at an early age and attended the Ottawa School of Art. She went out west and studied in British Columbia for a small time. And when she was there, she met Emily Carr, whose work really influenced her own. And her artwork became kind of an echo of Carr's artwork in a lot of senses, which is very clear here. And so this goes back to what I was saying before about the idea that during this time and throughout the history of Canadian art, we see that Canadian artists have gone to the same places and rendered similar paintings, artworks as other artists before them or current to them. And it's interesting to see the way that each artist renders with their own kind of style, but also influenced by other artists that they were inspired by. This is one of my favorite pieces from the Beaver Hall group. So this is called A Descent of Lilies. So in the late 1920s, she moved from Ottawa to Montreal and then to Toronto, where she worked on window displays for the Eaton Company under the designer René Serra. This position had a significant influence on her artistic output, as demonstrated in this piece. The same year she painted this work, she began to contribute illustrations and articles to the Canadian Forum, becoming its arts editor. She was also one of the co-founders of the Picture Loan Society. So really interesting things happening here. And it kind of has this like fashion design element to it, but it also feels really surreal. Like the elements are floating in the image, and we get that feeling that's kind of Dali-esque of these um, women that kind of float through the sky and things that evolve from one image into the other. You can see the flowers, the lilies, but it's like lilies evolve into women, women evolve into lilies. It's a very like fluid painting. There's lots of movement to it. Here's Portrait in the Evening. So this is a bold exercise in color and pose, and an informal portrait of National Gallery of Canada director Eric Brown. And there's like a vivid personality that comes out through the markings in the shirt and the couch, even the position of the leg and the carpet underneath the chair. We get the idea that it's a very intimate setting. You know, it's not like one of the portraits that we've seen before, as let's say Mary McIntosh, who we saw was the woman with like the flapper headpiece sitting in her fur. Like that was a very formal sitting, like way to be sitting, whereas this is a lot more relaxed. And this seems like the kind of portrait that you wouldn't mind sitting for, because you don't have to sit still and you don't have to be all posed and proper and poised. You can kind of just hang out and read your book while you're being painted. Here is Salmon in the Galley. So after Nicol married Norman MacLeod in 1936, the couple moved to New York City, where she continued to paint, creating numerous studies of her daughter Jane. She returned to Ottawa in 38-39, and between 40 and 48, she and Norman would visit his hometown of Fredericton, where she taught summer art courses at the University of New Brunswick. During the Second World War, she was commissioned to paint the women's division of the Canadian Armed Forces, recording their activities in works such as this Salmon in the Galley. So this painting reminds me of a little bit of the work of Marc Chagall, in the sense that the women, the figures kind of look like squiggly, like they're kind of like serpenty a little bit, in the sense that their forms aren't straight, and some of them feel kind of squished into the frame, particularly the one in the middle at the top. And we kind of see that in some of Marc Chagall's work, and in his contemporaries that around that time. And so we're getting this feel of kind of there's lots of movement going on, but it almost has like a dreamy feel to it. And the vibrancy of that salmon, you know, there's so much going on in the painting that it balances out the vibrant, you know, red of the salmon. But if the rest of the image wasn't quite so busy, the salmon would for sure take the focus out of everything else because of its vibrancy. Here's a fan favorite. This is Prudence Heward at the theater. So interestingly, there's quite a bit of literature that says that Prudence Heward wasn't actually considered a member of the Beaver Hall group, but it depends where you read. I chose to keep her in the group to demonstrate, just because I wanted to show some of her pieces, because I think that it's doing the Beaver Hall group an injustice if we don't include her with them. So in At the Theater, we have depicted women in a public place unaccompanied by men, reflecting the growing independence of women in the 1920s. Here we see two young female subjects seated together, waiting for a performance to begin. The theater has been discussed as a space in which men and women go to see and be seen. It has also been Hewer's depiction of the women in the public space recalls in the Lodge, an earlier painting by American artist Mary Cassatt, which we actually saw last art history course that we did when we were looking at Impressionism and Post-Impressionism. Hewer likely would have been familiar with Cassatt's work because of her knowledge of late 19th century painting. So here we have a very close-up image. You can see the detail of the lace work on the woman on the right's, the back of her dress. And you can also see some nice detail of the woman's braid buns on the left. So not only is it quite avant-garde to be painting two women unaccompanied at the theater, but to be painting such close-up imagery of not a nude, but an exposed decent part of a back, as I said, is quite risque. Here we have Girl on a Hill. So with this portrait of Montreal dancer Louise McClay, Hewer positions herself as a modern artist depicting modern subjects. McClay is seated in a country landscape, her hairstyle and loose-fitting dress reflecting the more liberated fashions of the time. Modern dancers commonly dance barefoot, and McClay's bare feet are in the foreground, their dirty soles adding a touch of realism to the work. Her reddened cheeks and nose suggest physical exertion, as though she has stopped to rest after a performance. She looks directly at the viewer, but rather than facing us full on, she turns her head only partway, her slightly wary expression accentuated by dark, unsmiling lips. So this painting was instrumental in establishing Hewer's reputation as a painter in the late 1920s, and the painting won first prize at the 1929 Wellington Arts Competition, established by the Governor General of Canada, and American critics praised the painting when it was included in the exhibition entitled Paintings by Contemporary Canadian Artists, which toured the United States in 1930. So the other thing that is striking about this portrait that Hewer was known for was painting women who were, I don't want to say like looking defiantly at the viewer, but not really concerned with necessarily how pretty or how pleasing or how attractive they looked. In the sense that you'll see in a lot of Hewer's imagery, in a lot of her paintings, there's no smiles of the woman and no indication of the sitter smiling in her portraits. I mean, maybe in some, but she's known for the fact that women are looking with very kind of strong looks with strong gazes at the viewer. Again, in this one we see. So this is called Rolande. Hewer often painted women in rural settings. She enjoyed painting and sketching landscapes around Fernbank, Brockville, where her family had a cottage, as well as areas in rural Quebec, such as Knowlton and Laurentians, Eastern Townships. In this work, a young woman stands with hands on hips in front of a fence wearing an acid pink apron. The intense color sets the subject apart from her subdued surroundings. The fence also serves as a barrier between Rolande and the farm behind her, suggesting that this daughter of farmers is symbolically turning her back on the past. You know, a sort of woman of the future is stepping outside the fence of her farm. And what I find super interesting about this painting is that everything besides her face looks very kind of fake, like it looks very conspired. Um, but the rendition of the skin and the look in her eyes and her pursed kind of lips is very real and very kind of strong. It almost looks like that face isn't meant to be in that pink apron. And I guess that's part of the message in the painting is the idea of her turning her back or going against family tradition. Even the fact that she has her hand on her hips and her foot up, it's like she's asserting herself. This is at the cafe with Miss Mabel Lockerbie. So again, this represents a theme favored by Heward, which is women in social settings. And it's also a favorite theme by many European male artists, the idea of the solitary female seated in a coffee house. For Heward, this spoke to the freedom of women, to women's increased freedom and their desire to be alone in public spaces. And Mabel Lockerbie, which was a fellow artist, has shown up in a few of Heward's paintings. It was a preferred, I guess you could say, a preferred subject matter for her. Again, with the look on Lockerbie's face, here she doesn't look directly into the, she doesn't look directly at the viewer, but she's definitely not being rendered in a way where she's, the artist or the sitter was trying to be made to look super attractive or to the gaze of the onlooker. There's no smile. She just has a very straight face. And she seems to be unfazed by the men that are around her, whereas she sits as a woman alone in her kind of very outgoing red dress. This is a little bit different because this does play into the seductive eye. So this is Girl on a Hill. So, Girl Under a Tree. So Girl Under a Tree is a rare example of Heward depicting a white female nude. It was also a personal favorite of the artist, the only one of her own paintings she hung in her bedroom. Although this is her only confirmed painting of a white female nude, and the literature says that because she painted some Indigenous and Black nudes. Her sketchbooks at the National Gallery of Canada reveal that she did numerous sketch studies of both male and female nudes. So this one, the background setting is resembles the one for Roland in that it's very kind of inspired, like it's just, there's just angles and colors. It's very flat. It's very kind of surreal in a sense. And then you have that juxtaposed against her very detailed, very realistic flesh of the female body. Even the lines of the muscles and the ribs and the toes, the wrist bone, the finger bones, everything is very chiseled. And here, although the female is still not looking at the viewer, the idea of being sexualized and sensualized and attractive is present clearly in the fact that one, she is nude, and two, the lips in this image are quite red. And now we will move on to the avant-garde, Alfred Pellin, Les Automatistes, and Painters 11. Before we move on, did anybody have any questions or comments about the Beaver Hill group before we close out that section, or even about the group of 7 that was before them, before we close out that section and move on? No? Okay. So since the 1920s, artists in English Canada have been heavily influenced by the landscape painting of the group of 7 painters. The, sorry, just give me 1 second here. The Canadian public often regarded modernist movements such as Cubism, Surrealism, and Abstract Expressionism as bizarre and subversive. The acquisition of modernist paintings, even impressionist works, by public galleries was invariably a source of controversy. Alfred Pellin was a pivotal figure in introducing modernist ideas to the Quebec art scene. He encountered a relatively welcoming climate when he returned from Paris in 1940, a striking change from his experiences 4 years earlier when he was refused a teaching position at Montreal's École des Beaux-Arts due to his radical style. At the time of his homecoming, many of his contemporaries had never seen work with Cubist or Surrealist elements, but the prevailing attitude was one of curiosity, both among his fellow artists and within the broader culture, thanks to a process of modernization that had been launched by the provincial secretary. Against this political backdrop, in 1940, the Musée de la Province mounted the artist Alfred Pellin's first solo exhibition called Exposition Pellin. Art historians have identified this exhibition as one of critical impact in Quebec. François-Marc Gagnon, acclaimed art historian, argued that that through Pellin, Canadian painting was catching up with international movements. In the history of Quebec art, Pellin is known as a figure who heralded the advent of modernity as part of a wave of social and cultural progress. I know that this is a little bit dense, but I'm setting the stage for all the artists and pieces that we're going to see after this. But he was not alone in the endeavor. Another name that became synonymous with modernism is that of painter Paul-Émile Bordua. While Bordua's outspoken political stance made him a symbol of the separatist movement during the Quiet Revolution, Pellin, who found most arguments in favor of separation to be one-sided and excessively dogmatic, remained on the sidelines of these discussions. Nevertheless, Pellin's critique of tradition and commitment to innovation were instrumental in setting the stage for modern art to flourish in Quebec. It has been said that Pellin's actions became the catalyst for the radical change inherent to Bordua's work and ethos. Although Pellin and Bordua originally worked in tandem to confront old ideologies and challenge conventions, hostility developed between the pair sometime in the early 1940s. This would endure the rest of their lives and careers, although the exact source of the antagonism is hard to pinpoint, but some have defined the tension as a stylistic one. The two men had radically different approaches to art making. However, 2 essential issues seem to be at the heart of the artist's discord. First, Pellin opposed the manner in which Bordua had adapted the surrealist concept of automatism, a process in which thought is expressed free from any control by reason, independent of any aesthetic or moral preoccupation. In Pellin's opinion, no single technique should stand as an end in itself. He did acknowledge the potential of automatisme, but believed that artists needed to expand on the basic concept. For him, it served as a preparatory tool on the basis that it should be elaborated. Paul-Émile Bordua and Jean-Paul Riopel spearheaded the modernist collective known as Les Automatistes as early as 1941. However, their artistic influence was not quickly felt in Canada in English Canada, or even really beyond Montreal. In 1948, Bordua published a collective manifesto called the Refus Global, which is an important document in the cultural history of Quebec and a declaration of artistic independence and the need for expressive freedoms. The decision to write the manifesto was partially influenced by Jean-Paul Riopel, who had recently signed the Surrealist Manifesto Rupture, inaugural during a visit to Paris. The Refus Global was published in a first edition of 400 copies, which went on sale at the Librairie Tranquille in Montreal on August 9th. The manifesto's denunciation of the Catholic Church's authority was particularly scandalous and resulted in the group's public humiliation. This ultimately led to a kind of martyrdom, and Bordua was dismissed from his position at the École du Meuble and unable to find work, and eventually left Quebec permanently in 1953 to go to Paris. Although the group dispersed soon after the manifesto was published, the movement continues to have influence and may be considered a forerunner to the Quiet Revolution. Okay, last little bit here. Alongside lyrical abstract painters in France, les automatistes favored a fluid painterly technique over the comparatively reserved hard edge abstraction so popular in the US and Eastern Europe at the time. Much like a non-figurative group of seven, they were looking to create a distinctly Canadian artistic identity. Heavily influenced by surrealist manifestos and poetry, their work was largely stream of consciousness inspired, which is the idea of automatisme. It's automatic stream of consciousness. So it's continual drawing, continual painting, continual dancing, whatever the activity is that you do, it's continuous. Believing that this is to be a truer means of communicating some subconscious emotions and sensory experiences. They wanted to be liberated from intention, reason, and any kind of structure in order to communicate universal human experience without bias. This resulted in increasingly crude or intuitive methods such as applying paint with palette knives, fingers, and painting blindfolded, as well as, you know, when writing for a certain amount of time without like lifting your pen or pencil, or drawing without lifting your pen and pencil for a certain amount of time and just seeing what comes out. In comparison to this was all in Quebec. In Toronto, artists Oscar Cain, Walter Yarwood, and Harold Town discussed the possibility of mounting a group show of abstract paintings to strengthen public appreciation of the contemporary art form. A few weeks later, they persuaded Simpson's department store in Toronto to display some abstract paintings alongside their modern furniture. During a publicity photo shoot for the Simpsons exhibition entitled Abstracts at Home, they proposed a group show idea, and a subsequent meeting established and led to the formation of a group known as the Painters 11. So we are going to look at Alfred Pellan, then Les Automatistes, and Painters 11. I know that was very long-winded, but again, I needed to set the stage. So first, Alfred Pellan. So here we have Sans Titre Canada West, which is going to then go right after this one with a Sans Titre Canada Est. So in 1942, Jean Désy, the Canadian ambassador to Brazil, commissioned Alfred Pellan to create two works for the reception room of the first Canadian mission to Rio de Janeiro. The first of many public murals by the artist, these two compositions depict imaginary landscapes intended to represent the West Coast and East Coast of Canada. West Coast is formidable with the massive mountains in white, blue, and green that stand in stark contrast to the red and blue sky. An industrialized metropolis containing remnants of the neoclassical Parliament building in Winnipeg is depicted in the lower right corner. Because mural art engages with a given architectural space, and indeed many may even modify such a space on occasion, the genre is anchored in site specificity. Artists must consider the structural context of the building in which the mural will be placed. Whereas a traditional mural approach would involve painting directly onto the wall, Pellan created large-scale decorative panels that covered the surface. In doing so, he freed his murals from their architectural constraints and created a spatial opening via the imagined landscapes depicted on the canvases. As portals of sorts, they allowed the viewer to be transported to Canada, but neither Canada East nor Canada West represent any actual location. Rather, they are a personal interpretation of certain characteristics of a nation. They are the result of a spirit of someone that passionately loves the land he paints, its people, its animals, and its heaven. Tasked with creating art to be displayed in a building that represented Canada abroad, Pellan needed to conjure an image of the country through his murals. His animals, symbols, and landscapes had to be easily recognizable as Canadian. So this, again, is Canada West, and then this is Canada East. So here the background is made up of blue tinted hills, red and green fields cut by white and pink paths, and small blue and white houses. A great lake is in mauve dominates a large portion of the painting, while tall sharp-edged ochre cliffs draw the eye to the right. Rendered in fantastical hues, a bear, a deer, and a beaver, all animals associated with Canada, are placed in the foreground. Although that looks like a caribou, even though it says a deer. For many years, this pair of paintings, this is interesting. For many years, this pair of paintings held pride of place above the reception desk in the Lester B. Pearson building in Ottawa, where Pellan's murals were installed in 1973, when Queen Elizabeth inaugurated the headquarters of what was then known as the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. But in 2011, John Baird, who oversaw the department, swapped the whimsical landscapes for a photographic portrait of the Queen, taken in 2002. As a spokesperson for Baird noted at the time, the switch was part of a celebration of the monarch in the year leading up to her Diamond Jubilee and was timed to coincide with a visit from the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge. 4 years earlier, later in 2015, Canada East and West were returned to their previous home on the wall of the newly renamed Global Affairs Canada, a move that implicitly signaled a renewed interest in emphasizing Canada's distinctive identity as a nation in its own right and not simply as part of the British Commonwealth. Pellan's unique vision of the country's national mythos played a key role in communicating this notion. So two massive panels that, I mean, you know, you may look at them as they're kitsch in the sense that they're all things that represent Canadian culture, that people sort of what's the word I'm looking for? That people sort of characterize Canadians by, kind of tongue in cheek in certain ways, but I mean, it actually is that. And it's actually a good representation, a good generalized representation of the West and the East Coast. If you didn't know anything about Canada and you looked at these two comparatively side by side about like, okay, well, what differentiates the West from the East, you would kind of have a pretty good idea. Here's Pellan's Four Women. So he became notorious for including bold explorations of sexuality in his work. And this was among a group of paintings that were censored in a 1956 exhibition. This canvas depicts four nude women in various positions, kind of unabashedly posed. Their bodies are disarticulated, stylized, and awkwardly contorted, and each figure's face is reduced to its most basic elements. The center of the painting is occupied by a monumental female nude who reclines with her legs spread, an inviting gesture that provides an intimate view of her body. Yet there is an undercurrent of kind of anxiety in her sensuality because of the way that her hands are positioned and because of the way that her eyes are staring straight ahead. there's almost a feeling of um, like anxious energy. This is kind of mirrored by the other three females who kind of look like they're squished into the painting, kind of the same idea as before, the salmon in the galley, with those women who I said kind of reminded me of characters who you would see in a Marc Chagall painting, that they kind of look squished into the frame. This you kind of see here in Pellin's canvas as well. What's so incredibly interesting in this painting is all of the detail. And the fact that this is oil on canvas. Like if I looked at this at first glance, I would probably think that it was a print because of all of the small point detail work and like the difference of pink on black, black on pink. Like it looks like something that could have been done with a silk screen or with like a printing. But he was also known for these kinds of little detailed patterns. Here we have L'amour fou, hommage à André Breton. So Mad Love, homage to André Breton. So this reflects Pellin's engagement with surrealism, a fascination of his for more than 40 years, as well as his friendship with André Breton, one of the movement's key writers. A portrait that somewhat resembles Breton sits toward the bottom of the canvas, which is dominated by red and cut with splashes of green, yellow, black, and white. A female figure is in an impossibly contorted pose, stands on top of the male face, stabilized on the right by a massive dismembered hand. The composition reveals Pellin's ability to create something new and highly personal based on his own interpretation of l'amour fou, or mad love, as defined by Breton in his 1937 book of that name. Collapsing the barrier between carnal and spiritual love, this surrealist concept brings together desire, freedom, and beauty, and illuminates the transcendent in everyday encounters. Now, it doesn't mention this. This is kind of like a very classic surreal. It's classic surreal imagery in the sense that a lot of imagery in surrealism kind of doesn't make sense, you know. I mean, just the same way that it, you know, that a Picasso done in Cubist, form, you know, the facial features are not in the right places, and things are kind of like off place and like off centered. In surrealism, we often see things that are part of one thing and part of another, or the shape again is different. It's not quite as square as Cubism, hence the name Cubism, but the contortion, the eyes on the fingers, the teardrops coming out of the eyes on the fingers that also look like blood drops. And again, as I was going to say, it's not mentioned in the literature, but I find that the woman's body looks like a human heart. And like her limbs look like the aortas. And the veins that are painted onto her body, which could also look like roots, but they also look like the vascular makeup of a heart. Does anybody else see that? I was surprised that it didn't mention it in the literature.
Yeah.
And now that you say it, definitely.
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah. The heart. Where would you, oh yeah, Montreal Museum of Fine Arts. Have you ever seen it?
No. It's
Look how
funny.
big it is. It's big too.
Yeah, it's funny because when I saw that it was at the Montreal Museum of Fine Arts, I was like, have I seen that? I feel like I would remember seeing that because I've been to the MMFA like a million times. but I don't remember seeing it.
No. Well, you know, the museum, our galleries are always taking out and putting in, you know, they're rotating artwork, so you never.
For sure, but I feel like this one would be like one that people came to see. Do you know what I mean? So I feel like they would keep it on. I feel like they would keep it on permanent exhibition as much as possible, which would mean that out of all the times that I've been there, I probably would have seen it at least a handful of times.
The hand with the eyes, it is so original. My
Yeah, it's cool.
Yeah, I don't think it's one that people would come to see.
No? Oh, I do. I mean, it depends. Like if you're really into surrealism.
Unlike tons of the others you've shown that I'm dying to see. Yeah.
Well, you know, people who are into surrealism are really into surrealism. And if you are into surrealism, then this would be an interesting piece, I would think.
Yeah, it's quite interesting.
Sure is. Okay. Moving forward. So I wanted to put this piece in because he dabbled not just in painting, but he did sculpture as well. And you know, as art history moves forward from kind of this point in history, a lot of artists become, and I mean probably beforehand too, but it was just never as well documented. Artists are kind of multi-functional, multimedia, multifaceted and multi-talented people. If you're an artist, you don't necessarily just paint. You know, you could draw, you could be good in theater, you could be good in, you could be, you know, versed in music, you could be whatever. The idea is that I wanted to show something besides painting, and this piece actually kind of has an interesting story. So this is called Mini Bestiaire, so mini bestiary, and this is created primarily between 1971 and 75. Mini bestiary is a collection of small stones which Alfred Pellan transformed into insect-like creatures by painting on faces in bright colors and adding wooden legs. Most are decorated with patterns of dots and stripes that draw the eye. Their expressions are open, bright, and curious, even smiling at times. Many of the fantastic beasts in Pellan's paintings, sketches, and illustrations provoke feelings of distress. And in 1974, his nightmarish beings devour helpless humans whose mute faces communicate their pain. In contrast, the comical mini bestiaries reveal the artist's playful character. Pellan was fascinated, as we said, with surrealism and often used his work to reframe the movement's philosophies to better correspond with his own ideas on love, eroticism, freedom, and art. The mini bestiaries were an important evolution in this process. Pellan had explored haptic impressions in his garden series, but now the strange creatures that populated his took on real form and shape and began to invade the material world. This development allowed the viewer to interact with Pellan's work on a concrete level, touching and feeling it. Breaking the dimensional barrier between the work of the observer granted new access to the artist's thoughts and experiences. While handling these curious animal objects, we can almost imagine ourselves being transported to their point of origin, a colorful rock formation in the Gaspésie of Quebec. Pellan, so the first interesting part of that is the fact that he would let people touch them. Oftentimes, and so that makes art more interactive. And again, as art history moves forward, art becomes more and more interactive. You know, how often do we go to museums or when we see art in any places, and we always see these do not touch signs. There's security guards around making sure that nobody touches anything that is being displayed. Well, Pellan was breaking barriers here in allowing people to touch and manipulate his artwork to have real tactile experiences with them. So in 1944, Pellan visited the small town of Percé in the Gaspésie to see his friend André Breton, who was on a trip there. Breton had briefly settled in the region to finish his book, Arcanum, and he compared the shapes making up the rocky landscape to a symphony, driven by his impassioned agatomania. Breton would spend hours searching for the colorful rock formations, expeditions that Pellan eagerly joined. So these two guys would go on walks looking for rocks and rock formations. So as Breton recalled, Pellan came here in 1944, and we met again at Percé. We were both interested in rocks and went looking for them on the beaches of Lens-à-Beaufils and elsewhere. The two men talked and walked, and they walked and talked about art as they collected rocks, shells, and other natural objects. Nearly 30 years later, Pellan's imagination was sparked by these small stones. In their shapes, he saw the weirdest and most whimsical animals. So part of the reason why I put this in was because when I was in wine school, when I did my sommelier course last year, my teacher told me about this time that he spent in Percé in the Gaspésie, and he used to walk around and find these rocks and he would make faces from the rocks. So some rocks he found, he said, looked like noses, and some rocks he said he found looked like eyes, and some looked like faces, where he would glue the noses and the eyes, and he would make these little rock formations. And he ended up having an exhibition and ended up selling some of these rock formations to people. And it just, when I read this story about Pellan, and when I thought back to that story, and I always, when I was studying with this man Jean Baudin, who was my teacher in wine, I always thought about him as like an artist, because the way that he spoke and the way that he was passionate about all different things in nature and art, and he loved ceramics, and he loved Chinaware, and all kinds of similarities, like that, all kinds of character traits that you find in artists. When I saw this parallel being drawn between Pellan and him, I thought to myself, it's really interesting how history repeats itself, and how people who have artistic tendencies and creative qualities within them will see the beauty in things that other people won't. And so that's why I thought it was important to add this part in. Looking at it, it's just very funny, but when you think about and read about the stories behind it, it brings like a richer context into it. So now we're going to go into Les Automatistes. So Les Automatistes were some of the first artists to bring modernist painting to Canada, and some of the first Canadian artists to embrace avant-garde gestural abstraction, or gestural abstraction meaning action painting, which is a style of painting with spontaneously dribbled, splashed, or smeared paint onto the canvas rather than being carefully applied. Gathered under the leadership of Paul-Émile Bordua in the early 1940s, they were inspired by stream of consciousness writings of the time and approached their works through an exploration of the subconscious. They published the Revue Globale in 1948, and it became one of the pillars of the Quiet Revolution, a period of intense change in Quebec. I know I said some of this before, but I'm just reiterating. Revue Globale was an anti-religious and anti-establishment manifesto, one of the most controversial artistic and social documents in modern Quebec. The Automatistes were not solely painters, but also included dancers, playwrights, poets, critics, and choreographers. After 20 years of challenging the politically and religiously repressive Quebec society, the group disbanded in 1960 after the death of Bordua. So the members of Les Automatistes are listed here. Paul-Émile Bordua, Marcel Barbeau, Roger Fauteux, Claude Gavreau, Jean-Paul Riopel, Pierre Gavreau, Fernand Leduc, Jean-Paul Mousseau, Guy Boremans, Marcel Ferrand, and Françoise Sullivan. So the ones, we're not going to look at all of their work, just because of time constraint. But the ones that we are going to look at are the ones that I have put in yellow rather than in red. So we are going to be looking at some work by Paul-Émile Bordura, Jean-Paul Riopel, Marcel Ferrand, and Françoise Sullivan. And I chose these artists because Bordura was like the father of les automatistes. Riopel was an incredibly important artist in like the history of Quebec art. And, you know, the only one who art history has really compared to like Jackson Pollock and the art and the abstract expressionists of the States. Riopel was very avant-garde when it came to gestural abstraction. And then I chose Marcel Ferrand and Françoise Sullivan because they were the two women in the group. And I always like to identify women artists and show some of their work, but also because they were not they did as well do paintings, but Marcel Ferrand was an exceptional stained glass artist. And Françoise Sullivan, among other things, she was a performance-based artist. So here we have Still Life by Paul-Émile Bordura. And I showed this one because, this occupies an important place in Bordura's early work, reflecting the influence of his teacher, Ozias Leduc, which we looked at work by Ozias Leduc and specifically his still lifes earlier on in the course. So Ozias Leduc, who often worked in this genre of still life and occasionally used the idea of trompe-l'œil. I don't know if any of you remember what trompe-l'œil is, but it's the idea of something looking like it's further away or closer than it really is. It's a tool that an artist uses, to make something look like it's falling off the edge of a table, or in Italian Renaissance architecture, it was used in the domes of cathedrals that they would be painted to look like the sky. So it was the idea like the church was reaching into the heavens type thing. So here Bordura takes a pineapple, a pear, and grapes as subjects for his still life, differentiating himself from Leduc by including the exotic pineapple. Leduc, as we remember, painted apples because his family owned orchards, and he also painted onions, as well as objects familiar to local farmers, such as candlesticks, books, a violin, but never anything exotic. Also, there is not even a remote hint of trompe-l'œil in Bordura's painting. The table on which the fruit is arranged is set at a pronounced angle within the image plane that reveals the influence of Paul Cézanne. So again, if you remember from our course, I guess it was in the spring, no, last year, where we looked at Cézanne's work, Cézanne used a lot of interesting angles. It was when he started playing around with notions of cubism. So he started changing the angle for things. And here, Bordura starts to do this. The black outline with which he surrounds his objects in his composition possibly reflects the influence of Georges Rouault, whose work Bordura grew to admire during his early days in Paris. Often considered a lesser genre, still life provides an ideal framework for formal explorations of volume, contour, and composition. It is not surprising that still life was a favored genre among the Cubists, but also among anybody who was playing around with different styles of painting. So this image I showed because it was a transitional image between Bordura's old work, which, he did landscape, he did genre paintings, he did academic style paintings when he was at school. But this was like a departure point where he started to delve into the idea of abstracting things, like the black contour, although they say that it could be an influence of Georges Rouault, to me, it's just him applying shadow, but applying it in a different way that makes it more opaque and contoured, like working his way towards abstraction. towards playing with light and dark and contour and line and image. So here we see that he's gone further into abstraction. So this one is called Torso. This painting is a good example of an early automatist work executed without preconception. So Bordua did not say to himself, I'm going to paint a female torso. He recognized the subject in an instant when the work was completed. This is one of the 45 gouache images shown at the Hermitage, an exhibition hall owned by the Collège de Montréal on Côte des Neiges in downtown Montreal. No other exhibition space could be found for these works, then judged to be surrealist and very abstract. For a long time, they were titled simply Abstraction and numbered, though in Boldua's papers, they were identified only by a number and in some cases by a literary title. Today, the gouaches are easy to understand, but they present quite a challenge to some critics with different notions of modern art. So when the literature says that, you know, he did this without intention, he was just painting with different color and different shapes, and then once it was done, he looked at it and determined that it was a female torso. I know that some might say like, oh, well, that's contrived, or maybe he had an idea before he started painting it. I mean, you never know what's going on in a person's subconscious when they start to paint something, and maybe that's the way that things manifest themselves. But I personally have painted before where I've put on, let's say, like a background color, like a background wash using a few different colors, and all of a sudden, like without any intention, and then all of a sudden you start to see images, you start to just see form, you know, like that has been created on the canvas. So it's like, if you start to work with that form, well, then maybe one thing becomes another, becomes another, becomes another, and then eventually you have an image. And that's the way that some people construct their abstract imagery. This is my favorite of his. This is called Leeward of the Island, or Sous le vent de l'île. So for a long time, this canvas was dated 1948, the year of the manifesto was published. The correct date, actually being 1947, was later established by Bernard Tessèdre when he was a visiting professor in the art history department at the Université de Montréal. He identified the canvas in a group photo taken on the occasion of the second exhibition of Les Automatistes, held from February 15th to March 1st, 1947. The 1.47 in the title most likely refers to the date of its creation, January 1947, or else it is a sequential number identifying it as the first canvas painted in 1947. From 45 onward, Bordua assigned dual titles to his paintings. For example, the artist's inventory contains the notation 131, canvas sold Monsieur Maurice Chartres, and so on and so forth. So in the previous slide, it was said that sometimes he only gave his paintings sort of numerical titles. Sometimes there were literary titles, but from 1945 on, he gave them both. In his automatist paintings, objects more or less float or are suspended, as in Leeward on the Island, in space above a background that extends outwards or in depth. To emphasize the contrast, the ground is painted with a brush and the objects with a palette knife. Notably, even when biomorphic forms are suggested, as they are here, the use of a palette knife enables Bordua to avoid the soft forms typical of the style of the surrealist Salvador Dali. Bordua always maintained a distance from what he called dreamlike surrealism that Dali was famous for. He increasingly favored the palette knife, which gave a mineral character to his images, and explicitly resembles cliffs, the mountain faces at Saint-Hilaire, rocks, sea ice, or glaciers features that are reflected in the titles of many of his paintings. So when I first saw this painting, the green and red, the form is done with a palette knife that sit on top of the background done with brush. And I find that that's very interesting, that sort of contrast between the softness of the brush and the harshness of the palette knife. And also the idea, like also visually speaking, it looks like the brush, all the brush strokes are horizontal. And even though the palette knife, the paint may have been applied horizontally, because I know how a palette knife works, still the shapes all seem vertical. But anyway, when I first saw this painting, what struck me, I thought it looks like feathers. And you know, when you read the description that has been given by the art historian, it talks about like that they're supposed to resemble, have this like mineral feel, that they're supposed to resemble rocks or rock formations. I find that to me, I find that they look a lot lighter than that. And I get this, like I said, like a feathery feeling to it. And they seem kind of whimsical, not just in their shape and form, but also because of the fact that they're so bright in color compared to the background. Does anybody else get that? Like, does anybody else feel that, or do you see more rocks? Or
I'm not sure what I see, but I love
I was
it.
just gonna say, or do you see anything?
I absolutely love it.
Yeah,
Yeah, I love the colors, and I love, and I obviously saw the horizontal and the vertical.
yeah.
Yeah.
I feel like it has like a feeling where it's almost like they're almost dancing on top of the background, you know?
Yeah, yeah,
Very vibrant. In comparison to the background, because the background is very muted, not just in texture, but also muted in color. So here we see it's evolved again. So we've gone from that sort of still life that looked like it was kind of abstracted to the, excuse me, to the leeward image, sorry, to the torso, which was much more abstracted form, to the leeward where he's going like more abstract expressionist, like automatist. Now we've moved forward and we're losing the color palette. Like the color palette is becoming more simplified. So this is called blossoming. So this painting, created soon after Bolduah settled in Paris, overtly expresses an adherence to what the critic Clement Greenberg calls American type painting. So you see, it's like moving more towards this abstract expressionism. In Paris, Bolduah felt more and more American, or at least North American and less French. Remember, we said in 1953, he had left Quebec and moved to Paris. Not that he was like excommunicated, but kind of. Blossoming is a testimony to the impact that New York painting had on Bolduah, and it distances him definitively from automatisme as it was defined in the 1940s. This is not to say that Bolduah renounces non-preconception in his painting. Rather, this time the adventure follows a different compass. A true all-over painting with no hierarchy among the elements and no major focal point. So no hierarchy among the elements, meaning that there is no focal point, but also that like none is more important than the other. You know, like in the last painting that we saw, there's a clear background, a clear foreground. We don't see that here. Blossoming gives the impression that it might easily continue beyond the edges of the canvas, or that even a fragment of the painting could create the same effect as the entire work. Greenberg uses the term all-overness in his attempt to distinguish from the European tendency to compose a painting by giving more or less importance to the elements within it, such as the opposition between the center and the periphery of the painting. So there's still some color in it, but like I said, his color palette is getting less and less. And like the eye still naturally tries to look for formations and forms within the framework, within the canvas. Again, I still feel a little bit of like a feathery feel to this. Like if you told me that this was like an abstract of like birds, I would believe you.
To me, it
Yeah,
looks
that's
very much
exactly
like a
what I
birch
see.
tree.
Oh, sorry.
Sorry, Diana. I see a birch tree.
A birch tree also, yes. So yeah, because of like the colors and like the texture of like birch bark. But sorry, who was saying that?
I was,
Oh, hello.
to me, it looks like birds. That was
Yeah.
the first thing I saw.
You get the like you get a feeling of like feathers, like wings almost, right?
Yeah.
Right. So we went from still life, abstracted still life, to the more abstracted torso, to the sort of non-shapes but still quite vibrant color palette of Leeward. Then we come to this where we're losing our color palette, and it's more about this all overness. And then we come to this, which is called the Black Star, and is actually long considered Baldio's masterpiece. It was awarded a Guggenheim International Award shortly after the artist's death. It had been under consideration for exhibition at the Guggenheim previously during his lifetime. Sorry. And so the reason why this was loved so much is not just because of the simplicity of the color palette, but because of the textural work. The painting displays the synthesis of Baldio's plastic language of his Parisian period. Oppositions between strong contrast, black and white, and more subtle ones, black and gray, because you see there's a little bit of gray in there, and there's actually even like a little bit of an undertone of brown, and a calculated distribution of the black and gray brown spots on the white ground. The black spots never reach the periphery of the canvas, but remain contained with the pictorial plane, thus ruling out a reversible reading, black on white or white on black. The suggestion of movement that emerges within the white ground by following the folds created by the palette knife are equally characteristic of Baldio's work at this time. We are thus invited to contemplate a black star detaching itself from a white sky, the reverse of the black sky to which we are accustomed. In 1957, Baldio could not have guessed at the existence of what astronomers have been calling black holes since the 1960s. He created a poetic image of them avant la lettre, which recalls the words of one of the great poets of Quebec, Saint-Denis Garneau. We decided to create the night for a single small difficult star. So, thoughts, comments on this being considered his masterpiece? Do we agree? Do we not agree? Do we have a hard time with this? Do we appreciate this?
I do not appreciate it. Mind you,
Me neither. I don't get it.
whoever mentioned last time that it looked like birch trees, to me, this could be birch trees.
Yeah,
Me
that
too. As soon as you said that,
Yeah,
whoever said it, that's the first thing I saw
Okay.
here.
that was Claire who had said that, I believe.
Yes, but I have a soft spot for birch trees, so I might find them wherever I want.
Well,
Yeah.
I do too, but
Well, again, like as I was saying, just before, with the idea of when Baldua did the torso and saying that he hadn't in his mind it's not like he was going into it trying to create a torso, but he saw it afterwards. And I said, well, you know, sometimes you have things going on in your subconscious and maybe it manifests itself on the canvas without you really being aware of it. All to say that abstract art, and especially art that's as abstracted and minimalist as this, is very subjective to the viewer's interpretation. You know, I always suggest that people, when they're going to an exhibition or when they're looking at a piece, that you look at it before you read about it. When people go up to, when they go to exhibitions and they go right up to like the plaque on the wall that's going to explain the painting, before they look at the painting and stand back and sort of give it a once over and develop like not necessarily an opinion about it of I like it or I don't like it, but consider it, you know? I really truly feel that when it comes to abstract art and non-objective art and minimalist art like this, that it's important to consider it before you read about it, because maybe you'll be spot on to what their interpretation was or to what their intention was. Maybe it'll be completely different, but I feel like people in general will have a better appreciation for work that's abstracted this much if you give yourself a chance to consider it before being told what it is or isn't. Because it allows for more engagement of it, you know? When a painting that's a landscape, that's like a romantic landscape or a piece by the Group of Seven or whatever, it's easy to interact with, to engage with, because there's a lot going on in it. There's different color, there's different form, there's different shapes, there's different, and oftentimes it's a relatable image. With stuff like this, it's like you have to allow yourself to be a little bit more creative with it because it's not as evident. So we move on to even more confusing things for some eyes. Riopel. So in Decalcomania, Jean-Paul Riopel abstractly painted a portion of a piece of paper and then folded the page obliquely, producing a mirror image of what he painted. He added energetic brushstrokes to complete the work. The title refers to a strategy used by artists to remove themselves from the creation of a work of art through chance, a technique which fascinated Riopel. His creative process became informed and motivated by attempts to produce a final composition directed by fortuitousness and embodying the act of not seeing. In this sense, this work is an example of the automatisme Riopel practiced during the late 1940s. The decalcomania process, apparently invented in 1750 by Simon François Ravenet, consists of marking ink spots on a sheet of paper, which is pressed onto another clean surface, wood, metal, glass, and so on. The purpose is to create a composition from the random shapes that are revealed through this method, such as the bicycle wheel and lion that happen to appear in a painting called Lion Bicycle or many others. The technique was employed by the surrealists who enthusiastically embraced any opportunity to bring the element of chance into art. So that plays into the idea, you know, when, you know, you used to see these images in psychology, like the ink blots, right? Where it would be like an ink blot on, so it's the same kind of process. So it's like an ink blot on, let's say on one side of the paper, you fold or in the middle of the paper, you fold the paper, you open it up, and, you know, the psychologist asks the patient, you know, what do you see here? And, you know, maybe depending on what you see, that speaks to your mental state and what's going on in it. I'm sure that we all have like a memory of seeing those kind of like ink blot images, right? So this is a play on the notion of that, but it is then emphasized. So he did that kind of quote unquote ink blot treatment and took that as the base for his image and then evolved on that. So here, which is one of his like earlier pieces before he goes completely abstract expressionist, before he goes completely lyrical or action painting. I mean, it's still action, but we can still see brushstrokes. We can still see some like movement on the paper that has been done by hand type thing. And, you know, when you also have to think about when you're considering abstract art, you know, it may not be as interesting to look at for some people because there's lack of form, and it's not as legible as other paintings are. But think about it in relation to, you know, a room where like the idea of like a painting tying a room together because it has like bits of colors that come from that go into like the couch and the chair and the carpet and the wall and the whatever. You know, the fact that Painters 11, who we're going to see after this, their first exhibition came after having juxtaposed their paintings beside modern furniture in a Simpsons showcase. That's like really like the first, like the beginnings of people buying artwork as a decorative as a decorative factor in their home, right? Buying it for merely its aesthetic beauty to go to match with the room or to match with their decor. So if you can't see this painting for what is underlying and behind it and what like the intention was of the artist, look at it for if you think it would look nice in one of the rooms in your home, and maybe it'll be more tolerable for you. So here we have Untitled Stroll. So in 1949, Riopelle abandoned the brush for the palette knife and began creating what would become his most iconic works of art. He called his preferred utensil a couteau, French for knife, most likely influenced by the English term. Nonetheless, in this work, there may be a few remaining traces of brushstrokes where the arrangement of painterly elements has been compared to tesserae of ancient mosaics, which I see. It almost looks like it's like mosaic stained glass or a mosaic like cut paper. It is not a completely satisfactory comparison because mosaics, whether figurative or decorative, follow a preconceived plan and generally a preparatory drawing and a pattern. But under the influence of automatisme and French avant-garde, Riopelle painted directly on his canvas with neither a pre-established idea, drawing, or study. The piece was composed, so to speak, before his eyes and according to no program. This was the central tenet of the style, to proceed into an art without knowing and to arrive at a place unknown as a result. So the idea of action painting and of a lot of the artwork that we're seeing at this time and from the automatists, some people have a hard time with it, as I keep saying, but what we really have to remember if we're considering this as a period in art history where like important changes were made is the difference between paintings being created for you know, up until now, paintings have been being created for the outcome, for the end result. And at this point in history is when artwork starts being created with the process in mind. And what that process means and where that process comes from and how we relate to that process. So it's almost like a precursor to performance art, to conceptual art. It is a precursor to conceptual art. It is conceptual. But like to installation art, where, you know, in installation art, it's about being in an environment and how we react to the environment around us. Like when you think about exhibitions that you go to where it's just like light reflections or different mood lighting, or when we think about like Yayoi Kusuma, where she is creating these rooms that you walk into and how you relate to these rooms. So it's about, and that's relational art, right? But before relational art, you have conceptual art, and before conceptual art, you have action art, and before, and like that's where this kind of comes from. So this one, I put the Monet's water lilies underneath it because I felt like this would help you relate to the image. So this is called Pavane. So the great triptych Pavane is one of Riopel's most famous paintings, not only because it has been widely exhibited, but also because it received immense critical acclaim. The piece is named after a ceremonial slow dance that was performed in costume at the Spanish court during the 16th century. In this composition, comprising 3 panels, texture plays an essential role, while a gentle cadence seems to guide the overall flow of color. As he had done with a different one of his works, Riopel created the work by squeezing oil paint directly from the tube onto the canvas surface. He applied pigments seemingly spontaneously, guiding the motion of the paint with a palette knife to build up a deep and imperfect automatist style of impasto. Impasto is when you're building straight onto the canvas with paint. Today, Pavane is proudly owned by the National Gallery. The painting looks back to the last great series of works by Claude Monet, Water Lilies, or Nymphéas, found at the Musée de l'Orangerie in Paris. Its alternative title, Hommage aux Nymphéas, and the explicit reference to Monet are attributed to Riopel's close friend and critic Patrick Waldberg. Riopel's rhythmic palette knife strokes and combinations of shimmering color give the work an organic impression. It is as if the piece quivers with movement in a similar manner to that of Water Lilies. The vast composition depicts, without seeking to mimic, the living materials of the natural world: water, plants, flowers, and above all else, fleeting light. In Pavane, Riopel went against the ideas of the French art critic Georges Dutuy, who asked the artist to create voids, spaces that were thought, spaces where thought can and should move. In response, Riopel created a scene where movement prevails over everything else, from top to bottom and back again. So, do we appreciate this one a little bit more because there's more to it? Like, you can, like the past couple of images that we've seen, it's hard to separate the colors, right? It's like everything is applied one on top of the other, on top of the other, on top of the other, and it becomes very messy, so to speak. But I feel like this one would be a little bit more accepted or appreciated by you all, because you can separate the colors a little bit more. It almost lets you create an image a little bit more, or at least a difference between light and dark, and you can see, like, you can see colors better. And it doesn't, I mean, although it's heavily layered, it doesn't seem as messy, if you will. And I feel like because it's compared to, well, it's an homage to Monet's Water Lilies, but I feel like when you juxtapose the images right next to each other, you can almost feel it. Not necessarily see it, but you can almost feel where it was coming from.
Oh, Erin, I just wanted to say, when I'm looking at this style of painting, you have to see it live. You cannot see a picture of this, because if you're standing in front of that canvas, you feel the energy of each dab of paint. You know, you want to see, there's so much energy coming out of this style of art, but I think you have to see it live to see the paint. You can almost feel it being applied to the canvas.
That's a very good point. Yeah, very, very good point. A lot of these paintings, first of all, a lot of these abstract expressionist paintings are huge, right? So, and there's a reason for that, because they were able to move more and splatter more, and it becomes almost it's an experience to see them, and it's an experience to kind of like be in their presence, and part of the experience is the vastness of them, but part of the experience is also the texture of them, like the amount of layers. And when you talk about impasto, like impasto is like thickly applied paint. So this is also the point in art history where texture in paintings becomes a factor, whereas before people were just, I mean, in academic painting, people were trying to apply their paint to the point where it didn't even look like there were any brushstrokes, right? And then impressionist and post-impression, well, impressionist almost more than post-impressionist, it was about those thick brushstrokes, letting them be seen. And this is like a level up from that. And with the palette knife, there's always going to be texture. So yeah, thank you, Gwen, good point. Okay. And so this, again, I wanted to show that these artists are multifaceted, and that Automatisme wasn't just about painting. So this is called Joust, and it's a fountain made by Jean-Paul Riopel, and arguably his most important work of sculpture. Cast circa 1974, this kinetic public art installation is an imposing grouping comprised of 30 bronze elements that surround a tower of life and depict various animals and mythological figures, including the owl, fish, the bear, and the dog, drawn from Riopel's childhood and imagination. The jousting question is this work in this work is not it's not a game of it's the idea of like a game of capture the flag. So like all of these sculptures, the idea of them playing together in the water. The model for the joust was first made of clay, then recreated in plaster, and then cast in bronze in 1974 in Italy. 2 years later, it was installed at Montreal's Olympic Park for the 1976 Summer Olympic Games near the P9 metro station. Riopel was not pleased with this location because a cafe soon opened a short distance from the piece, and he felt it trivialized his work. Thanks to the generosity of many donors, the sculpture was transferred to Place Riopel in the heart of Montreal's business district, where it is located today. So it's clearly just outside the Palais des Congrès. So I know we're almost at 2:30, and I have to do a hard stop at like 2:40 because I have to pick up my daughter. But I want to show Françoise Sullivan and Marcel Ferrand and Gwen. This one's for you because she's best known. Françoise Sullivan is best known as a pioneering figure of modern dance and one of the signatories of the 1948 Manifesto Refus Global.
Yes, I know of this person.
Ah,
Yeah.
cool.
She was connected to Le Grand Ballet Canadien indirectly, very.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So Sullivan also produced an extensive body of performance and installation work, photographs, sculptures, and paintings around issues of primal energy, movement, improvisation, and art's relationship to its environment. With a career that spans more than 70 years, Sullivan is one of the most versatile and enduring artists of her generation. This piece called Dance, this is a still from, it's kind of harder to show these pieces, but this is a still, meaning a picture, of her performance Dance in the Snow, or Dans la Neige. This is part of an improvised cycle of dance solos dedicated to the seasons, initiated by Sullivan in 1947, soon after her return from New York. Instead of performing in a studio, she would dance outside without an audience, interacting with the elements and the landscape. She intended to execute 4 improvisations to be filmed and presented together as a complete work, obviously 4 because the 4 seasons. In February 48, she set out for Otterburn Park, southeast of Montreal, where her artist friends, Jean-Paul Riopel and his wife lived. Dressed in a sweater, a long skirt, leggings, and fur-lined boots, she improvised dance in the snow. The sequence of movements was vigorous, suggesting a crescendo of emotions and raw energy. In the silence of the frosty days, Sullivan's broad gestures were echoed only by the crunching of her steps on the thick, rough layer of ice covering the snow. Riopel filmed the performance, while Maurice Perron photographed it. Perron's iconic pictures remain the only record of the event. Riopel's film has been lost. So not only is this performance art that is recorded in video art, and that is recorded also by photographic art, but this is also collaboration because they are a group of artists that are working together to create this piece. So you have the performer, you have the videographer, and you have the photographer that have all captured this moment in time. So collaborative work, also something that comes up. You know, there had been artist, excuse me, there had been artist groups that had been together, like the Group of Seven, but the Group of Seven were never really known to paint on each other's paintings. And yes, you know, for things like the Sistine Chapel, or, you know, like big sculpture works, or you know, big stained glass pieces, you need different people doing different parts. But basically it was always an artist that had assistants, whereas, you know, yes, they assisted her in creating this piece, but because they were part of an art group together, it's definitely considered collaborative work. So this one is called Black and Tan. So set to the music of jazz pianist Duke Ellington, this dance piece attempted to capture the expansive power of movement. It rejected altogether vertical movements such as leaping and spinning, which were the hallmark of classical dance. Instead, Sullivan started by moving her feet close to the ground, tracing a figure 8. The movement then spread through her body, traveling from one body part to the next, gradually gaining her calves, her knees, her thighs, her hips, her rib cage, her shoulders, her neck, and then her head. Her use of facial expression was innovative and contrasted strongly with classical dancers' traditionally impassive features. When the movement reached her face, Sullivan stood still, facing the audience, tracing the figure 8 only with her eyes. She's wearing a costume by Jean-Paul Mousseau, designed for Black and Tan. It was photographed by Annette and Basil Zarov and the dance collection Dance Archive from Toronto. Sullivan had originally planned to dance the piece wearing a fringed shawl that she had borrowed from her mother, but her friend and painter Jean-Paul Mousseau offered to create a costume for her. The costume enhanced Sullivan's movements and gave her the appearance of a shaman channeling transcendental energies into the human world. Black and Tan was first presented publicly at Ross House in Montreal in 1948 during a recital that showcased choreographies by Sullivan and by Jean Renaud. And this was considered to be the earliest modern dance presentation in Quebec, which is quite important. It evoked Sullivan's first encounters with jazz music, as well as the African-American dance culture she had come across in Harlem when studying dance in New York in the mid-1940s. Named after Ellington's 1927 jazz composition, being Black and Tan, it also refers to an expression then used in the American South to designate the bars where people of African, Asian, and European descent were allowed to mingle, listening and dancing to the music. So super cool here. This is Eris Ludus. So in the mid-1960s, Sullivan started to experiment sculpturally with movement. Hung above the ground by cables that tend to disappear in the light, Eris Ludus comprises a series of circular and square shapes that swing in the wind in a way that evokes dance and that chime when they collide. The dynamic effect is accentuated by the apparent mismatch between the enormous bright red and asymmetrical steel base and the lighter upper structure from which, I know it looks orange, but it says it's bright red. And the upper structure from which the seemingly weightless shapes dangle into the void. Unlike Sullivan's earlier sculptural works, Eris Ludus does not simply suggest movement, it is a kinetic sculpture. So making a kinetic sculpture at this time, and a big public piece like this by a woman was quite important. It is very different, however, from the mechanized kinetic works that were being produced in the 1960s by other sculptors. The movement of Sullivan's work is irregular and unpredictable and recalls her earlier danced improvisations. The playfulness of the work, its title means aerial play in Latin, is in stark contrast with the industrial materials that it is made of, as well as with the welding techniques Sullivan used in its creation. So this sculpture was presented in 1967 as part of Sculpture 67, an open air exhibition organized by the National Gallery of Canada in the context of Canada's centennial celebrations and held in Nathan Phillips Square in Toronto by Toronto City Hall. It was later donated by the artist to the Musée d'Art Contemporain of Montreal. And we're gonna finish Sullivan. This is called Walk. So in 1970, Françoise Sullivan walked from the Montreal Museum, the Musée d'Art Contemporain of Montreal, then located at Cité du Havre, across from Montreal's historic port and downtown core, to the Musée des Beaux-Arts on Sherbrooke Street. This performance was the first in what would become a series of documented walks by the artist. Documentation of the work included 32 square black and white photographs and a map of the city onto which the path the artist followed is traced. Sullivan took the pictures herself, adhering to a self-imposed rule. Each time she arrived at a corner, she would photograph whatever was directly in front of her, ignoring as much as possible subjective impulses or aesthetic concerns. The images show buildings, roads, vehicles, advertisements, and street signs, highlighting the visual complexity of the environment and suggesting that culture is what happens outside cultural institutions as well as inside of them. In the 1970s, many artists were questioning the role of art, its commodification, and the seemingly pointless accumulation of works in museum collections. They were also trying to break free from artistic traditions they felt had become sterile. Although Sullivan agreed with this position, she was uncomfortable when artists suggested that museums were no longer needed. So this was her response to that kind of predicament. She was showcasing the importance, she was bringing the two together. So sort of bringing art of what happens outside of museums and like tethering it between, or tethering the two museums that were the most important in Montreal. So tethering them between this string of art that was happening in between the two of them. So I, full disclosure, was really not that aware of her work before putting this course together. And I'm like blown away by her. I want to research her much more because I find that she's super interesting and super revolutionary and so multifaceted. And the idea that she was doing the first performances of like modern dance in Montreal and then took that dance and turned it into these big industrial kinetic sculptures is unbelievable. It's fantastic. So we're going to end there for today. We have one more artist to go through, Les Automatistes, and then the Painters 11, and then next week. So next week we'll start with that, and then we will move into contemporary art that we're going to have to fly through because we've already added one extra week, but I just keep putting too much material into my slideshows. So yeah, any questions, comments before we leave each other?
It was wonderful, Erin.
Thank you.
Wonderful. I
Yeah,
loved it.
really, really exciting to hear this.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
the way you put it all together, I mean, it's just wonderful.
Thank you. Any favorites? Any ones that you were like, ah, I didn't get that one, or oh, I really loved that one, or
Yes, the one of, it was, I took a picture of it. I'm gonna send it to you.
okay.
Loved it. I loved it.
I
couldn't
loved,
name of the
I loved
artist.
the West Coast, East Coast.
Yeah,
Oh, I
Who's
like them
that?
too.
I loved that.
yeah.
Yeah, I
I'd
like,
love to
yeah,
see that.
I'm wondering, can we go see them, Gwen, in Ottawa?
Are they still there at the Lester B. Pearson building?
The building they said was renamed to the.
Yeah, Global Affairs.
Oh,
There's-
yeah. So I don't know if it's open to public, but it's a government building. It must be,
I
no?
know, so that's what I wonder.
Well, Gwen and I went there one time and I don't remember what was there in the entrance. You can obviously walk into the entrance and those are so big, you'd think that's where they'd be.